Good morning. Thank you all for joining me today and us. I'm really excited about spending some time with you. We're gonna do a couple of things or attempt to this morning. We will first, there will be some presentation part, which is you listening. There will also be some participation part, and I hope that you will participate. We'll throw you in breakout rooms, so if you don't, you're just going to stare at somebody else silently. It is understood that some of you may not be able to be here the whole time. It is a long period of time we've set, and that's okay. The amount of time that you're here is the amount of time that is appropriate for you to be able to give. And so I thank you and I honor that time with gratitude. So what we're going to do is every once in a while, I just sent my colleague here, Sarah, a document just so that there's a variety of things going on. Every once in a while, I sent her a document of quotes, and she's just going to put the quote in, and we'll just let it hang in the chat for a minute or so. And you're going to guess whether the quote is Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, or Chairman Fred Hampton. I'm hoping that we'll get some people who get them right and some people who get them wrong. We have decided to do this event on Friday instead of Monday for a couple of reasons. The first is that the reality is that we talk about King and we situate him in this myth that we have generated and created that is not based in reality. It is terms like whitewashing or sanitizing the message of King, the movement of King, in order for there to be mass consumption. We'll cover this a little bit in the presentation. But what also has happened then is it has lowered the amount of Black voices in the general sort of conversation. And so I want to make sure that we also understand that there are other Black leaders in that time period. The reason we're also not doing it on Monday is that if we're really going to make racial progress, we can't expect to only do it on the days off or the holidays selected. We have to understand that this work of learning, of action, has to be done outside of the designated days. So I am grateful because if you came on Monday, you were either compelled by your organization to do so, or you were doing so at your own personal cost of vacation time. Doing so today means either you yourself or your employer has said, it's okay for us to compensate you for this work. That's an important step, that when we move towards this work of equity, that we're willing to have a cost, maybe small or maybe large. So you being here on a Friday, that's not a day off, that's not a designated day, not a holiday, means that you individually are more likely to actually care about this work. What that also means is that you, all of my friends here this morning, all 46 of you and those of you who will catch the recording later, you are leaders in this work. Let that sink in. You have raised your hand on an issue not required of you. That makes you a leader in this work. Now, having been designated, you can no longer not be a leader in this work. So you must go from this place knowing that you are one of those who has raised your hand and said, I want the world to be a better place and I will make it a better place. Thank you for joining that work. Now, we have too many people to do introductions of everyone here, but we will do some breakouts and you'll be able to say hi to individuals at that time. I want to just say, looking around this room, we have a wide cross section of individuals. And so thank you. We've got different industries. We've got different people within structures of power. We have different genders, and I'm sure identities, sexual orientation and sexual identities, and a wide range of individuals. This work must be interdisciplinary and it must be intersectional. And so not only should your passion about racial justice and issues help to bring you to this conversation, but it should also bring you to other conversations that you're less familiar with. And so without any further ado, I am going to hop on this slide. Now, I'm also going to let you know, this slideshow is going to move really fast at times and probably not meet completion because I got really excited last night and added to 2 different presentations I've done before. So I now have a 58 slide presentation. I promise you we're not going to go through all 58 slides, but do not let me have an evening alone where I am not sleeping. It doesn't work out well for anybody. So give me 1 second here to pull up this slideshow. So I am Kevin Ressler, President and CEO of United Way of Lancaster County. I didn't mention that. You probably all know that. You registered for this session. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. You can find this in the autobiography of Martin Luther King if you're ever interested in it. But it is a robust, full-out timeline of Dr. King's life. And so starting at the beginning of his life, just a few highlights I will mention. Which is important to his narrative, is that he was ordained and appointed as assistant pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church. That was a church that his family had been a part of leading for a long time. He received a Bachelor of Arts at Morehouse. Dr. King started college at the age of 15. He skipped multiple grades rapidly. Was a very intelligent man. We know this, but I don't know that we always recognize the depths. You'll sometimes hear individuals who claim that he plagiarized his doctoral thesis, and there's an attempt always to sort of, denigrate his achievements. But what's really important to recognize is actually how excellent he was academically. He went to Crozier Theological Seminary, so he has a background in divinity training, is not just sort of an itinerant preacher, but is actually a scholar within systematic theology, and then became a pastor, and would be a pastor with all of the work. We sometimes forget about that, and that part of his work is really rooted in his faith. So he also begins, as he sort of progresses, starting here in the 50s, we see to be part of the movement towards racial freedom and justice, starting in the 50s. So we think oftentimes about MLK and the I Have a Dream speech, and we think of him at the voting rights in the mid 60s, but it is important to understand that movement work does not just start at the end, right? There is often, Rosa Parks sat on that bus time after time before she was arrested. You have to show up and you have to be vigilant. And as I often say, when it comes to activism, is you protest until policy. You do not protest until promise. So in the 50s, King is already, just to point out that in the 1950s, King is already meeting with high-level political individuals. Vice President, later President, of course, Richard Nixon, in 1957. During a book signing, Dr. King was actually, and I'll mention this later as well, but Dr. King was actually stabbed by an African-American woman who was having a mental health break. And she, at the time, she was having a break and had a letter opener, thought that he and communists were plotting against her personally. But just to mention that he's at that point writing a book, he's already gaining notoriety and being seen in the 50s. Meets with President Kennedy as a candidate as well in 1960. 1960 is when things really start to pick up in the timeline, where we start to see a lot more movement in politics of the day broadly. Other highlights, this is a really important one, we're going to talk about this a lot here in a few minutes, is the letter from Birmingham jail that Dr. King writes. And I'll cover a little bit more of what that is later, but Birmingham is a hotbed of racial tension and issues. You may remember from high school, one of the few things they do to mention in high school when talking about racial issues is Bull Connor. You've seen the pictures. This is the dogs and the hoses and the clubs and the cattle prods and 4,000 demonstrators in downtown Birmingham. Oftentimes what isn't expressed is the amount of individuals who are going there. We only see the pictures of individual moments of the chaos or of King at the front of the line. We don't often see the total breadth of how many people were really a part of this movement. And that's a very important part of understanding social change and movement, is and particularly nonviolent social change, it requires a mass amount of individuals standing up and saying no more. Shortly after is the March on Washington. We all know the March on Washington, right? We've got A. Phelps Randolph, Bayard Rustin, who are really integral. There are other individuals who are helping write those speeches, helping coordinate all of that work. And so, we've seen the images of that. There, we usually do get the context of the large amount of individuals. King delivers the eulogy. This is just an important point to remember or to note. Of the 4 little girls who died in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. They bombed a church and they killed children. That is the level of vitriol that is being faced by Black Americans and that Dr. King is encountering, knowing that he's already at this point had numerous death threats. At this point, Robert Kennedy, who we often think of as a hero in our narrative around racial justice, authorizes wiretapping Dr. King and is in public being supportive and privately is not so. Dr. King is named Man of the Year by Time Magazine. He's the youngest individual ever at that point to be given the Nobel Prize in the same year as Time Man of the Year. Going to skip ahead here. What happens in the latter 60s, we'll talk about polling a little bit later, but what happens in the latter 60s is that Dr. King he never abandons nonviolence, never moves completely away from nonviolence, but does begin to be more aggressive in some of the both tactics that he's willing to employ and also broadens the scope of what he's talking about. Dr. King's Beyond Vietnam speech, which I would encourage you to go and find, really is the process of recognizing that there is a global disenfranchisement that is happening for Black and Brown individuals, but also the poor broadly. Dr. King begins to make a shift towards poverty. You may have heard of the Poor People's Campaign. In the late 60s, there are moments where Dr. King is recognizing that this isn't just about that fight for voting rights. I mean, of course, he's known this all along, but it's also not just a fight for Black freedom and liberation. This is a fight for liberation. You'll hear oftentimes criticism of Dr. King that he was a communist and those things. That's because he starts to talk more and more. He always has, but he starts to talk more and more. The beloved community, and that's part of the speech in the I Have a Dream speech has always been following up of what the sort of American nightmare looks like. And as we get to the latter 60s, he's really shifted strongly to talking about how Vietnam is unacceptable from a moral standpoint. It's really not even good militarily, and how it exploits poor white individuals as well as poor Black individuals, and all in order for us to go and kill poor brown individuals in another country. This shift also begins, as I mentioned, the Poor People's Campaign. Of course, King is leading a strike in March 28, 1968. King leads a march of 6,000 protesters in support of striking sanitation workers in Memphis. The march descends into violence and looting, which King is both rushed from and also condemns the violence, although there had been at the time and since attempts to associate King with what happened in that movement as if that was part of his plan, although it was not. He then returns to Memphis, hoping to lead the peaceful march to show that nonviolence is still of what is necessary to make the movement, gives his mountaintop speech, which is one you probably also have heard, and then is killed before he's able to lead that movement, unfortunately. So just some highlights real here, quick to set sort of what the environment is. In 1958, I mentioned this I highlighted this already, but he is signing copies of his book, Stride Toward Freedom, at a department store in Harlem when he is attacked with letter opener. So by 1958, again, we think normally of King in the 60s. By 1958, he already has some notoriety and is causing waves. Now I'm going to show you a few different resources. This book was published in 1958. It's a book I have on my shelf at home. I often find it interesting to look back at pieces of materials in the time they're at, not just looking at what we now write in reflection of, but what was being written at the time. So this book is a massive tome. It's a sociological tome, Racial and Cultural Minorities, and an analysis of prejudice and discrimination. It's not just about African Americans. It's about a wide range of individuals. I'm going to hop down here at the bottom. The Negro population in the South. Two major demographic changes have occurred in the South since 1930. The first, and sorry, just again, this book is published in 1958. So that's that same year that King is stabbed. The first change is the loss of 3 million population by migration, a figure equal to 1/4 or more of the South's natural increase. The second is marked trend toward urbanization. Outmigration was considerably heavier for the Negro than the white population, and despite a high rate of natural increase, the proportion of Negroes in the Southern population dropped from 26% to 23% between 1930 and 1950. The migration, so not reading here, the Great Migration, as it's called, is Blacks moving from the South towards the North. This creates an urbanization for Black Americans. If you remember, Black Americans, of course, were slaves, and as being slaves, their field of expertise was farming. Many of them would become different types of farmers, as is highlighted here in the bottom, where many of the farmers were white farmers, but Negro farmers, Negro families have a racial handicap in addition to the other disabilities of the farming group at the time, including illiteracy, a lack of representation or care from the political classes. And so if we go right here, land tenure among Negroes in the South is still largely a matter of some type of tenancy. So remember, tenancy, where you live. Slavery, were provided tenancy, of course, and no other compensation. And so after slavery, you still have some type of tenancy. A part owner is a farmer who owns part and rents part of the land he cultivates. Cash tenants are provided with land, a house, and fuel. In return, they pay a fixed cash rental. A share tenant, crop share, receives some fertilizer in addition to the items provided to the cash renter, and usually pays the landlord from 1/4 to 1/3 of the crop. This is where many Black individuals found themselves. They were now technically free, but their labor was designed as such that they essentially were still near slavery. Dr. King's grandparents would have been sharecroppers. His father, who left that environment, was proud to say that they never rented. They never had to rent the space, that he had gotten to a point where they owned, and this was an important thing. In the 1940s, you have World War II. This is a big diversion for Americans as well, because you have, in World War II, you have Black Americans going off as alongside white Americans to fight in World War II. When they return, white American males are given the GI Bill, which allows them to have property, buy property cheaper, get better preferential loans, get college scholarship funding. Black Americans were disenfranchised. About 1.4 million Black men in America were disenfranchised from the GI Bill. That GI Bill is why a lot of Americans today have wealth that is generational wealth, and why a lot of Black Americans do not. In the 1960s, when King was actually leading protests, just 36% of white Americans thought he was helping the Negro cause of civil rights. 36%. The Roper Center allows you to combine multiple polls over a period of time. In 1966, a Gallup poll found that more than 60% of the public rated King more negatively than positively. That's all races in America in 1966. Hopping back to 1964 here, he's Time Man of the Year. I mentioned youngest person to date to win the Nobel Prize, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 being signed into law, followed by the Voting Rights Act in 1965. If you are a person paying attention to the news today, you might be asking yourself, wait, I thought we were trying to get a Voting Rights Act passed now, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. In 2013, the Supreme Court gutted a lot of the parts of this 1964 law and the 1965 law, cutting out a lot of the teeth of it. And we have seen in a variety of states, last year, or in 2021, I believe, was 41 states had passed some form of legislation trying to restrict voting rights, which they can now do because the teeth were cut out. So if you're a person interested in advocacy, please go ahead and try to help us get, particularly, it is right now a challenge because it is the Democrats who have power are not all on board with Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin not being willing to make the procedural moves to allow that to pass. And of course, there are no Republicans who are supporting that, which is unfortunate because this has been a piece of legislation that was supported by Ronald Reagan, supported by George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, as well as all the Democratic presidents. Our partisan times are unhealthy and unhelpful. So in the 1966 Gallup poll, which I mentioned, found that almost 2/3 of Americans had an unfavorable opinion of Dr. King. This is 2 years after he wins the Nobel Prize, 2 years after he gets this most signature major piece of legislation over the hurdle. This is a 26-point unfavorable rate increase from 1963. As I mentioned, he was beginning the shift towards a broader conversation about racial injustice, yes, but also poverty and broad-based ways that we disenfranchise a lot of individuals. So 1968, King is widely criticized even by his peers in the civil rights movement. African-American leaders admonished him not to bring his protests to their cities. He did not have a good welcome when he went to Chicago and other areas, including LA, after the Watts riots. Black leaders such as Roy Wilkins of the NAACP and Representative Adam Clayton Powell of Harlem. King lamented, he said, their point is Martin Luther King is dead. He's finished. His nonviolence is nothing. No one is listening to it. A terrible sense of irony in that King would actually be dead in a matter of months later. Obviously, we know today that King is revered. The polls are something along the lines of 90% of Americans say that what he did advanced the cause of racial justice. Something like 85% of individuals have a favorable opinion of Dr. King today. Part of that is because we've sanitized the latter part of his life that was causing contention. Just to mention that the negative polling from Black Americans at the time was often because they either were afraid of the sort of rioting things that might happen in their community, but also there was large parts of Black Americans who had seen the civil rights legislation in the 1960s and did not see a tangible improvement in their conditions. The right to vote didn't help them even get Black politicians per se because of the mechanisms, gerrymandering and those types of things, but also, although they now have the right to vote, they were still struggling with getting jobs or hunger or other things of that nature. And so a large number of Black Americans at the time were really saying we need to be more militant and active in order to actually make a change. In 1966, it was 32% positive, 63 negative. Same year, Harris poll found that 50% of whites felt King was hurting the Negro cause of civil rights. Only 36 felt that he was helping. By the time he died in 1968, 3 out of 4 white Americans disapproved of him. In the wake of his assassination, after he died, 31% of the country felt that he brought his own assassination onto himself. This book here that I'm going to just briefly show you is by Chuck Stone. Chuck Stone is an individual who worked with, I mentioned Adam Clayton Powell and his dissatisfaction. Chuck Stone had been a long time worker with Adam Clayton Powell, writes this book. This book is fantastic. It was published in 1968, a mere weeks after Dr. King was assassinated. This book's like 300 pages. There's only 4 pages of reference to Dr. King. Just to give an example of how he was being perceived. This whole book is about the history of Black political power in America. Dr. King has been able to almost single-handedly be the driver to get the Civil Rights Act by galvanizing community support behind him, by working at creating systemic and social change, and he's barely mentioned by Chuck Stone. The largest mention here talks and references of his assassination, which again would have been an addendum to this book as it had been already in the publication process, but obviously needed to be mentioned. Mentions that no political event in 1968, unless the war in Vietnam should suddenly end, which of course it didn't, will have a more dramatic impact on the 1968 presidential race than the assassination on April 4th of the Reverend Martin Luther King. I'm not going to read all this, but no one can predict the extent his death will continue to divide this nation or encourage its unity. Black militancy, of course, will quickly fill a vacuum, and the ascendancy of Black political solidarity could have either detrimental or salutary effects on the body politic. More Black politicians following the increasing Black militancy might be encouraged to seek a Black togetherness that would alienate yet insulate the Black community from white political domination and in turn achieve greater Black political power. On the other hand, it is equally logical to expect some Black politicians to continue to maintain channels of communication between Black and white. Which will prevail, no one knows. Only one fact is certain: the United States of America stands on the threshold of the most critical period in its history since the first shot was fired on Fort Sumter in 1861. Americans have yet to come to grips with the problem of the Black man, his aspirations, his desire, and demand for the good life. And although many militant Blacks will not admit it, his full inclusion in a biracial American society. The mention of Black militants is at the time the Nation of Islam and others are actually working at what they would desire as a separate America, where there's actually 2 countries divided and managed in their own regards in other ways. So the open letter this one I'm going to read here real quick, and then we're gonna switch to something else. We'll come back to lecture later. But Alabama's clergyman letter to Dr. Martin Luther King, 8 Alabama clergymen, 1963. It is important to understand. This is in Birmingham. It's important to understand that these 8 clergymen, including down there on the right, you can see them. You can go ahead and read those. There's it's not all Christian. I believe that there's a Jewish rabbi, yes, as well. These are the moderate to progressive clergymen in Birmingham. We, the undersigned clergymen, are among those who in January issued an appeal for law and order and common sense in dealing with racial problems in Alabama. We expressed understanding that the honest convictions in racial matters could properly be pursued in the courts, but urged that decision of those courts should in the meantime be peacefully obeyed. Since that time, there had been some evidence of increased forbearance and a willingness to face facts. Responsible citizens have undertaken to work on various problems which caused racial friction and unrest. In Birmingham, recent public events have given indication that we all have opportunity for a new constructive and realistic approach to racial problems. However, we are now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led in part by outsiders. We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized, but we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. We agree rather with certain local Negro leadership, which has called for honest and open negotiation of racial issues in our area. And we believe this kind of facing of issues can best be accomplished by citizens of our own metropolitan area, white and Negro, meeting with their knowledge and experience of the local situation. All of us need to face that responsibility and find proper channels for its accomplishment. Just as we formerly pointed out that hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political tradition, we also point out that such actions as incite to hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems. We do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham. We commend the community as a whole, and the local news media and law enforcement officials in particular, on the calm manner in which these demonstrations have been handled. We urge the public to continue to show restraint, should the demonstrations continue, and the law enforcement officials to remain calm and continue to protect our city from violence. We further strongly urge our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. When rights are consistently denied, the cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders and not in the streets. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizenry to observe the principles of law and order and common sense. Signed by those clergymen. Dr. King in jail responds with this letter. So obviously, he had much to say. What I will comment here from his letter, I'm not going to read his letter, obviously. Never before have I written a letter this long, or should I say a book? I'm afraid that it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else is there to do when you are alone for days in the dull monotony of a narrow jail cell, other than write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers? If I have said anything in this letter that is an overstatement of the truth and is indicative of an unreasonable impatience, I beg of you forgive me. If I have said anything in this letter that is an understatement of the truth and is indicative of my having a patience that makes me patient with anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities, and in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation, with all of their scintillating beauty. Dr. King here is appealing to these individuals on their collegial relationship as fellow ministers. The content of the letter, I'm going to not read much because I'm going to ask a request of you to read this letter. You can Google it, you can find it, not in this moment, but a time when you can sit with it. It is powerful and it is important that this letter be understood, where he talks about what you're asking when you're asking for patience. I hope that, and I'm going to stop sharing right now. I hope that so far what you have seen is common threads that you hear even today, that you have heard. Oh, right. Every time there's a shooting, a school shooting, or what do we hear? Now's not the time to talk about gun violence. Let's talk about it some other time. We hear this when we see issues of Black Lives Matter protest. Oh, let the family mourn. It was an unfortunate circumstance. Now is not the time to talk about policing issues. This process is a very common process when we're dealing with the burgeoning issues in a community of contention and of challenge. So I'm going to step back from this, and we're going to move into groups. Sarah, if you can prepare to move people into groups of about 4, and we're going to be relatively quick with this here, but and then we'll come back and we'll do some more. But what I want you all to, at this point, is just sort of say to one another is anything that you heard that you knew, that you didn't know, or that sounds sort of uncomfortably familiar to this time. For those of you who are old enough to have been alive during the time of this, please, one of the most important things that we can always do is share the experiences and the knowledge that we have with others who don't have them. I'm a 37-year-old Black man living in America. I don't, and my mom's from Tanzania, so my Black narrative, my Black family is in another country. I don't have the historical experiences in my life to know what the tension or the feelings were at the time. So for those of you who would have been closer to that, I invite, but I ask you not only now and today, but beyond this, to share your memories and your honest stories, warts and all, with your communities of care and of spheres of influence. So, so let's see here. So so if we can just do like 5 in a breakout room, Sarah, just for a time, because we're only gonna, this one's gonna be short. We're only gonna take about 8-9 minutes. So just sort of real quick observations or thoughts, and then we'll hop into a little bit of a different presentation. All right, people should be returning here any second, and again, grateful for you all's time. I hope that you all had some good conversations there. Started looking at some of the names are here. I got excited. I've got some family members from California and Ohio. Hi, Uncle Jim and Uncle Will. Thanks for swinging by. And we just let in someone who I met when I did voluntary service for the Mennonite Church right out of college in San Francisco, where I facilitated nonviolence trainings in Oakland, California for Pache Bene. And actually, some of what we're going to do here comes from some of those resources. So I'm going to hop back into sharing a screen, and I'm going to give you it's a little bit of a trigger warning, because I'm going to show you some pretty hard pictures. We're going to go through fast, but I just wanted to give you a warning. The first picture is the picture that inspired the NAACP to hang "A Man Was Lynched Today," the sign, the flag outside. But the picture that I'm going to show you is disturbing. But unfortunately, I often think that it's also important that we encounter the truth in painful and disturbing ways sometimes too. So just wanted to give you that little bit of a warning here. And then I'm going to get back to sharing. So again, I hope that you all had some good time to chat there. From King to Black Lives Matter is the little section here. This is a disturbing picture. This is the burned body of Jesse Washington, an 18-year-old African-American man lynched in Waco, Texas, innocent of the crimes that he was accused of. The smile on this young man's face infuriates me and it makes me want to weep. Oh, that is the hardest picture you will see. The flag bearing the words "A man was lynched yesterday" was flown from the national headquarters of the NAACP between 1920 and 1938 to mark lynchings of Black people in the United States. The flag was purchased using money raised after the lynching of Jesse Washington in 1916 and was stopped from flying after the NAACP's landlord threatened them with eviction if they continued to fly the flag. Hangman's noose dangling from an automobile driven by a hooded Klansman. amongst warnings of blacks to stay away from a voting place in the municipal election in Miami in 1939. Dr. Samuel Green, the center over here, Grand Dragon of the KKK, in opposing President Truman's civil rights program, Klan demonstration in March of 1948. David Duke, KKK leader, in 1977, arrives at a roadside meeting with newsmen to detail how Klansmen are dispersed along the border looking for illegal aliens entering the country. On the right, David Duke, as he arrives, Louisiana campaign headquarters in 1989, 12 years later, running as a Republican, won by 224 votes for a seat in the Louisiana legislature. This is a picture I actually took when I was at President Obama's inauguration in 2008, and we had protesters hanging out there who were also shouting very significant racial epithets. 2013, this is a protest in Park City Mall that I helped to coordinate after Trayvon Martin had been killed and after Michael Brown had been killed. It was a die-in. When we had this protest, we had in the newspaper, the comment section included things like, "I'm wearing my golf spikes and I'm going to walk around the mall." 2017, this was a demonstration here in Lancaster in support of refugees coming, Syrian refugees and others, as we had outside agitators coming from all over the country to protest against our resettlement of refugees, Syrian refugees and others from the Middle East and other places. And so we had a demonstration in support. At the same time, 2017, a Ku Klux Klan chapter that exists in Quarryville, PA, our southern end, and is active. We're having a rally. So that's 2017. They still have rallies in the southern end, possibly quieter ones in other places in our county. This was in response to the Klan rally in Quarryville in 2017 outside the courthouse steps. A number of people all throughout the street. Hey, look, One United Lancaster editor-in-chief Tim Stoldrer was there. I'm not going to play this in the interest of time, but there's a documentary called Shut Up and Dribble. There's this little trailer you can watch that just sort of covers a little bit briefly of the history of telling Black leaders, which Black athletes are, Black leaders, that they should not do anything but perform their entertainment.
We're hearing that some
2018 March for Our Lives. This was a youth-led movement. We had 3,000 people. They asked me to help speak at that and help coordinate them a little bit, but that was them coordinating. It was impressive. High school kids all over the country, and particularly here in Lancaster, 3,000 of us marched through the streets in Lancaster, demanding better protections for our children in their schools. January 6th, insurrection at the Capitol building in Washington. It's nearly impossible to look at these images and not notice the prominence of Blue Lives Matter flags, which are flags that were created in direct conflict with or response to Black Lives Matter. This is not an anti-police statement by any means, but that is not a pro-police flag either. That is a pro-authoritarian flag, a pro-lack of accountability flag. You can be pro-police without having to be anti-Black. Trump over the USA flags, I found interesting as well. What is allegiance and how? And the Christian Association, there's a Christian flag there that we have seen since the time of the KKK. Real quickly, these are some of the cartoons in political cartoons in this one is 1968. I think it's called The New Politics, Signs of Protest. This one here in the middle says, "I don't understand why they can't behave as if they had good education, good housing, and good jobs." Because of course they did not. And this one here, "Brother Nero, do you smell smoke?" Harlem and Brooklyn race riots. "We shall overcome" here. This, if you can't see it, this violin says the NAACP and SCLC, that is Dr. King. These are famous Black figures. Here's a more modern one: "Never burned one building, never robbed one store, never destroyed one town, changed the world." This is a this is not this is the sanitization of Dr. King. This is a piece that was made in response to Black Lives Matter protests, essentially trying to implore that there is a particular way and people have to follow this, but this is also not actually a true representation of how things happened. One of the most famous political cartoons from the time, Anti-King, says, "I plan to lead another nonviolent march tomorrow." And in the background, of course, you see chaos. This one came, this is interesting. When King died, he had among his papers, this is Dr. King's personal papers. When King died, he had among his papers a copy of the Brooks cartoon that was cut out of the newspaper and mailed to him with the following missive: "How can you, a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, be such a deceitful hypocrite? You're not fooling anyone but yourself in your," and illegible in the writing, "your nauseating talk about nonviolence, and then you demand a program to overcome poverty and untold amounts of," sorry, illegible, but it says high living, there's an illegible word, "all over the globe to feed your own egotism." After George Floyd died, I and United Way wrote a statement about Black Lives Matter, and I received this private message in my Instagram. "Hey, Kevin, be prepared for the backlash against United Way of Lancaster County for your racial views. There are thousands of people who contribute to your charity that do not agree with what you are saying. Actions have reactions. People can decide individually and corporately not to contribute." My response: "Hey, William, glad to hear from you. Thank you for your personal thoughts and opinion on the matter. I'm glad you feel free to express them in a message to me, though I'm a little disappointed you don't feel that I have the right to express my opinions without retribution. Outside of opinions are facts. There are a group of individuals attending a protest by a self-proclaimed white supremacist group that the president has stated support of, attempting a coup on the United States government. Law enforcement is not pepper spraying out or firing rubber bullets. In Lancaster and many towns across America, citizens have been tear gassed, fired upon, and arrested for legally and peacefully protesting racial injustice. I sure hope that people wouldn't choose to punish community members in need or organizations who raise significant dollars to support because I hate racism. Also, you friended me for some reason. We've never met, don't know one another. It's curious that you had friended me and then attacked me for who I am. Oh, and I couldn't help but notice you're not a United Way donor, but thanks for your opinion." A little snarky, but so I want to show you real quickly here. Time check. Yep, let's show you real quickly here. And this comes from materials. Pache Benny Nonviolence Service has a book called Engage. I'm a trained facilitator in that process, but here's just a few things I wanted to show you from that resource, which is a great resource in understanding the principles of nonviolence. So Dr. King's principles of nonviolence. Nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Nonviolence seeks to win friendships and understanding. Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. Nonviolence holds that voluntary suffering can educate and transform. Nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. Nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. In our group, we talked a little bit of a variety of things, but one thing I wanted to bring out here is the power elite model. So these are two approaches to social and political power. And this is important in how we think about how we make change as we move from this moment. And one of the individuals in my breakout group was grateful that I had said to you all that you now have to be recognizing that you are leaders. And so I want to give you a couple of real quick, just sort of framework tools. The power elite model holds that society is organized in the form of a hierarchical pyramid, with powerful elites at the top and relatively powerless mass populace at the bottom. The elites, through their dominant control of the state, institutions, laws, myths, traditions, and social norms, serve the interests of the elites, often to the disadvantage of the whole society. In this model, power flows from the top to the bottom. Since people are powerless, social change can be achieved only by appealing to the elites at the top to change their policies through normal channels and institutions, such as the electoral process, lobbying Congress, and use of the courts. The focus constituency in this model is the power holders. The method of change is persuasion, either convincing existing power holders to change their view or electing new power holders. We see this in politics all the time. We're seeing this with the voting rights issue right now, that people are relying on the individuals in Congress to do what is right, and the belief that power comes from that. Now, historically, nonviolence movements understand that the people power model is more effective both in the short term and in the long term. The people power model holds that power ultimately resides in the hands of the populace. Even in societies with strong power elites, the power holders' power is dependent on the cooperation, acquiescence, or support of the mass public. This model is represented by an inverse triangle with the people at the top and the power elite at the bottom. People power is the model used by social movements. The movement strategy is not only to use normal channels in an effort to persuade power holders to change their minds, but also to alert, educate, and mobilize a discontented, impassioned, and determined grassroots population. This population creates change by leading the leaders, withdrawing support for the status quo and creating the conditions for the power holders to move off their position to one that reflects that of an increasingly vocal and active public. Thank you, Bill Moyer. I miss you. So I'm actually going to hop here and that out of order. 8 stages of social movement success. So we at United Way are part of social movement. Many of your organizations are. So this is hopefully helpful for you as you think about, you want to make change in your communities. This is the way that we sort of do this from a grassroots community-driven level. 1, critical social problem exists. Power holders support the problem, and we know that it exists. Number 2, prove failure of official institutions, right? So this is where your local groups start to form and help to recognize that the institutions aren't succeeding. Think about cash bail. Think about a lot of parts of our criminal justice system, not having processes of rehabilitation, but only incarceration and punishment. Ripening conditions, recognition of the problem victims grows. Public starts to see the victims as human beings, not just as issues. 20 to 30% of the public oppose the power holder policies. Take off is number 4. Trigger event, usually something happens. Either it's manufactured, so a nonviolent action, or something that triggers a response. 40% of the public oppose the current policies and conditions. We see this is where we sort of see the bouncing around of Black Lives Matter protests over the last couple of years. 5 is perception of failure. See the goals as unachieved, power holders unchanged, numbers down at demonstrations. This is that, again, this is that balance. So you see a Black Lives Matter protest, excitement, and then all of a sudden you see something happens and people don't show up. And then if something else happens, a trigger event, so there's a back and forth there. Number 6, majority public opinion. This is when the majority opposes the present conditions. This is the tipping point. This is where you start to see a paradigm shift. Number 7 is success. Large majority opposes the current policies, no longer fear the alternative of the backlash. And 8 is continuation. You extend the success into laws and formalizations. Yes, Beth.
I'm sorry to interrupt your flow. I just, we're in a current situation where majority opinion is disconnected from power and increasingly so. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on what happens there.
Yeah, no, so we have a comfortable populace. And so if we look at this is the same thing in a different chart form, Beth. And so what we have here is, right, the percent here is your percent of the population. Okay, so your steady state. You build up stress in the system. And then this is where you have that the trigger event is here. And then this is the sort of the bounce around of how the public support happens. Part of the problem that we have right now is we have different individuals who very firmly believe that, so the system is broken right now. And we have individuals on multiple sides of an issue that believe that there's failure happening in the system and are generating counterposing sort of grassroots efforts, some violent, some nonviolent, that isn't uniformly the same. But so what's happening is you're ending up add in digital communications, a lot of misinformation, and a lot of siloing and finding the information that you want. I think that really, in order to break a lot of this logjam, is being able to help us see the humanity in others, just mentioned. We've got to start interacting with people who we knowingly know disagree with us. We have to stop avoiding family gatherings because that uncle, that aunt, that cousin's going to be there. We have to stop having only social interactions, whether that's church or your country club or wherever you gather, being like-minded individuals. And we really have to stop living in communities that are same race, same economic structure, same political views. Our housing stock in Lancaster is old. It is the oldest continuous landlocked city. And what you find if you live in my neighborhood, which is all the old stock, what you find is there are big houses right next to small houses. We used to design our communities to have interaction on different socioeconomics, beliefs, and other diverse elements. We no longer do that. We now, after Levittown's coming out of the GI Bill, we now build communities that are uniform in cost and in design and attract uniform mindsets individuals, which creates schools that have uniform children with uniform backgrounds being taught by teachers who have uniform opinions. And we're just creating this it's an aggressive separation of who we are as a people, and it's a really unhealthy way of training. We're gonna jump back to a breakout here, and I'm gonna skip this doll story, but it just talks about a young child who was carrying a black doll. It's a real story, and people made comments. Young white child. People made comments I never thought before that about what it must be like for black children to carry white dolls, things like that. Women generally earn less money than men for performing the same duties. Contrary to popular myth, this is not because women get pregnant and have to leave the workforce, or because women leave the workforce to spend time at home with kids, or because women work part-time and fewer hours than men. Women earn less than men in the same occupation with the same education and experiences and the same amount of time put into their work. In the past, it was common to pay men more than women. That was widely accepted because men had families to support, women weren't in the workforce. Today, such practices are illegal. However, men still earn more than women, even for the same job. A few facts about this: 2/3 of all mothers are now in the labor force. This is a little bit dated. In 1996, African-American women earned only 63 cents and Hispanic women only 57 cents for each dollar earned by white men. Women and people of color on average earned less than white men with the same educational backgrounds. Often white men with less education earned the same as or more than educated women and people of color. For example, the average college-educated Hispanic woman earned only $21 per week more than a white male high school graduate. Over a woman's life, unequal pay hurts tremendously. It affects pensions and Social Security payments. For many women and people of color, growing older means growing poorer. Remember that on average, women live longer than men, so it's an accelerated or an expanded pain point too. Nearly 60% of full-time working American women who work year-round get paid less than $25,000 per year. In 1992, those receiving hourly rates, women's median hourly earnings were 79.4% of men's. For full-time wage and salary workers, women's median weekly earnings were 75.4% of men's. And median annual earnings for women were 70.6% of men's annual earnings. So we're gonna hop into a breakout again here. And there'll probably be different people because we've had a number of people who need to leave, and that's fine. We're going to hop into a breakout, and I want you all to react a little bit to what you heard, but particularly, I want you to focus on this issue of women and pay. And interest of time, we're going to be fast here, but just top of your mind, how would you think about trying to build a little bit of a movement around this issue? So we're running out of time here. What I want us to do is I want us to go around and say, anyone who heard or wants to share some idea that they had from their group of what we would do to start a movement around greater pay equity, and anyone can feel free to jump in.
I would just like to say in my group, I did a lot of listening, and I was really taken by something that Michael Chikiva said that he had done personally. And that is that he, as a man, as a non-brown white man, actually promoted somehow his wife to have fair pay because, he's part of the solution as well, having a wife and a daughter and knowing that there definitely is a gender wage gap. I was very impressed with that.
I think our group highlighted the gender wage gap somewhat in terms of promotions to executive leadership positions that tend to be more white men than people of color or women.
Yeah, and oftentimes when women of color or when people of color and women, and particularly women of color, are promoted to executive leadership, check the balance sheet of the organization and its last couple of years of performance. Oftentimes, the first time a woman or a person or male of color or a person of color at all is promoted to being that first-time executive, the organization isn't doing well. The job is no longer as attractive. My two major jobs in the last 10 years, United Way and Meals on Wheels, were both struggling organizations when I joined them. And I was the first Black executive for both of them. And I don't think that I necessarily would have been hired if we were at our highest points of those organizations in their history.
Interesting, but sobering.
I'll raise my hand. In our group, one of our younger participants really made some keen observations about transparency and disclosure. And the more of that that's available to the public to see, like public companies, nonprofits, that type of information, the fight for transparency is important. And it sounds just sort of, not so important, but it's critically important so that we can see what's happening in organizations and get a feel for how they're promoting, what they're paying. So more and more transparency all the time is really important.
Our group talked about that as something that we can take into our own hands, that we can share that information amongst ourselves as employees, and that may or may not be a subversive act depending on the culture of the organization. But that doesn't need to be a formal disclosure somehow that's made. That can be water cooler talk.
And the state you're in, Sarah, it is illegal in many states to share your wage publicly with another fellow employee. I don't know where Pennsylvania is on that right now, and I don't care, because as I told my staff, I'm not going to retaliate against them if they share with one another, even if it ends up leading to an uncomfortable conversation that I have to manage. I'm not going to punish people for being honest about what is reality. Now they're all going to go share their wages with each other at lunch. Have emails and stuff. I'm going to share one final slide here. Thank you to Rebecca O'Shea here is part of the United Way Pennsylvania team. This comes from our ALICE report. ALICE is the population that United Way focuses on called assets limited, income constrained, employed. And I know Joe's team at Central Penn Food Bank also looks at these dollars. This is a way of identifying people above the poverty line, which is an ineffective and ridiculous line that is not really changed since 1963 in its structure. So this is the cost of the cost of household basics outweighs wages. The household survival budget reflects the bare minimum cost to live and work in modern economy and includes housing, childcare, food, transportation, healthcare, technology, and taxes. It does not include savings for emergencies or future goals like college or retirement. In 2018, household costs were well above the federal poverty level of $12,140 for a single adult and $25,100 for a family of four. By the way, if you make the minimum wage in the state of Pennsylvania, $7.25 an hour, and you work for 40 hours a week for 52 weeks, don't take a day off, sick or vacation, don't take any time off, you will get paid $15,800 a year. You do not meet the federal poverty level of $12,140. So, and if you are on Social Security, we mentioned women, Social Security, and my colleague here, Feline, who replaced me at Meals on Wheels, can tell you this because we take in clients. Women's Social Security dollars are often lower, especially older ones, because they didn't enter the workforce as frequently. Oftentimes, you'll see $700, $800 a month for Social Security. At most people's full wage, you're going to be in around the $14,000 range. So here's the thing, my Joe Biden. Here's the deal, folks. So thank you, first of all, for sticking out. It was a long time, and I really appreciate y'all hanging out. I appreciate y'all sharing your truths with one another. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, you all raised your hands and said this is an issue that matters to you, not on a day that you had a vacation day, not on a day that your employer compelled you or forced you to come here. You chose to be here. You self-designated as a leader. I've given you a whole bunch on Dr. King, which is really, that's just the honey in the pot to get you to come here. So my real trick was trying to give you a little bit of tools around social change and to challenge you. And here's the part that you now also, now you're a leader, and now also you've actually begun the process of starting a movement. You sat in a room with people with a problem that was identified, and you began to talk about solutions. You can no longer tell anyone that you do not know how to make change in your community, because we just built the process this morning here. You figured out issues. No one disagreed that unequal pay is how we want our society to be. No one came back and said, we actually, our group decided that this is a good thing. Yes, women of color less, white women less, men, white men, yeah, it's construction. So we've all agreed that this is a problem, and it's a serious problem. It's a systemic problem. You've all come up with some ideas of how to begin to talk about it, how to address it. Now, the challenge for you all is to continue doing this. If you are a churchgoer, if you have a bridge club, or if you go to a country club, or just have an opportunity at lunch to talk with fellow staff members. If you're retired, if you're young, if you're older, it doesn't matter. You can make change in your community. And you should. And I hope you will. Any final reflections? I'll open the floor there.
I think just a community thank you to you, Kevin, for creating this space for people to learn, to reflect, and also create some of these action plans for the future. I think this was well worth time for all of us in individual as well as professional roles. So thank you for that late night ruminations and putting this together.
Thank you. Do want to have a special thank you to my team and to again, God bless social media. Hey, look, I posted on social media. I think she may have left now, but Kenda Horst was a woman who lived below me when I lived in San Francisco in 2008 and 2009. I don't think Kenda and I have talked in a decade, but she was here. And Will is probably out in Berkeley, my uncle there. You know, so I invited family. You know, be willing to expand to foreign networks and local ones at all times. So thank you, team, for your support. Thank you, individuals, for being here. Those of you who catch us on the recording, I hope that it was as impactful on the recording as it was for me personally, and I think for others here live. Please pay attention to the work that we continue to do. In the next coming months, you will see Project Blueprint is going to be rolled out from us. That is a training program that we're excited to be bringing back for underrepresented individuals on how to serve on boards. And we're also going to be adding a component that will be working with providing training for boards on how to be authentically inclusive when you do try to work at diversifying. So we're really excited about some of that work that we have coming and how we expand our awareness of equity so that we stay focused on racial equity, because it is the area of most urgent need, but we don't stop and think that that's the only place. People returning from incarceration, people living with a disability, people of various ages are all disenfranchised in various ways, and we need to re-enfranchise individuals and enfranchise groups for the first time. So we're going to be doing some of that work. Please feel free to look at that and how you can support as a volunteer, as a donor, and just as a person who spreads the word of what we're doing. If you are not already subscribed, our oneunitedlancaster.com news article sends out 5 articles of what's going on every week on Saturdays and helps cover the community. So you can get plugged in that way. Feel free to email Sarah or just reply to the invitation if you're not on our mailing list already and if you would like to be. And thank you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.